Hello and welcome to another one of our webinar sessions. This evening I'm joined by my amazing friend Rich Vaughn from the International Fertility Law Group to talk about travel into the United States during a time of COVID. As we know, way back when this all kicked off, the president of the moment, I guess he still is technically, President Trump, issued, technically not for much longer, issued a presidential proclamation which basically banned travel from anybody who's living in Europe to the United States, unless they could get around it using certain exemption rules. Rich, do you want to tell us a little bit about that and how things started, and then we can talk about the evolution and where we're at today?
Sure, and thanks for having me, Richard. I guess to start off with, I would just say, first of all, don't panic. This is just a little bit of additional planning. And for those of you involved in surrogacy in the US, it already involves an extraordinary amount of time and effort and planning. This is just one more part of the process. And every parent who has applied for permission to get here, at least through our office, has been able to get here for the birth of their children, and some for medical procedures. So what we should talk about first is whenever you're traveling to the US, first of all, you have to have valid travel documents. That hasn't changed. You have to have a valid passport, and you have to have a valid visa or ESTA or be in a visa waiver country. So assuming you have one of those in place, then the next step is to gain entry. That's where the presidential proclamations, the travel bans, come into play here. During COVID, of course, there have been spikes in cases in certain countries, and that's what led to the presidential proclamations, first with banning travel for anyone who had been physically present in China for 14 days prior, and then we added the UK, at Northern Ireland, the Schengen area of Europe, Brazil, and Iran as well. So the proclamation basically states that if you have been physically present in those countries, then you are not allowed to enter. So one way around that ban is if you can be physically present in another country that's not subject to the travel ban. But if you don't have that luxury, then if you have been present in one of those countries listed in the travel ban, you have to obtain an exception to the travel ban in order to be allowed to enter into the US. There are two exceptions that our clients have been using primarily. One is that if you are the parent or guardian of a US citizen child under the age of 21, you can be allowed to enter. So if you're in a situation in a surrogacy case where the birth has already occurred, then you are the parent of a US citizen child. Now that child is not a citizen until the child is born. So if the child is still in utero and has not been born, yes, you're the parent of a child due to be born, but the child is not a US citizen until birth. The other exception has been what's called a national interest exception. And the way this goes basically is you're telling the US government that there is a national interest that should allow you to come into the US. And with regard to surrogacy and coming to the US for the birth of a child, the argument goes like this: it is in the national interest of the United States that you be allowed to come here to be present for the birth of your child so that you can make medical decisions for the child and so that you can take the child from the hospital as soon as the child is ready to go, so that the US healthcare personnel, healthcare resources, etc., can be reserved for those emergency cases, especially the emergency of the pandemic itself. So that is an exception that's been working for most of our clients as well. There is a process to this, and you do need to be thinking about which avenue you get your permission to enter about 3 months prior to the birth of the child. That's when we start preparing our cases.
Okay, so before going down the process thing, you mentioned something just before about being physically present. Now, it's being physically present in that country for a period of time before trying to gain entry into the United States, correct?
Correct. The concern is that if you've been physically present in one of these areas where there have been high cases, this was why the
UK, for example.
Right. Let's say if you're in the UK, then you have to get permission to enter the US. So again, if you're a UK citizen and you've been in another country for the prior 14 days, and that country is not subject to the travel ban, then you are allowed to enter the US. You don't have a travel ban issue.
Right. So in effect, so what we could do from the United Kingdom is we fly to a country, Mexico, which is you can travel in, spend 2 weeks there, assuming you've got the luxury of time, of course, fly into Mexico, spend 2 weeks there, and then travel into the United States, onward travel.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Okay, brilliant. Well, that's good to know. Okay, so process-wise, once you've decided which avenue you're going to go down, how does that work?
So what we would recommend doing is 3 months prior to the birth or the due date of the child, start looking at this file. We actually, as a law firm, we prepare a file, and our goal is to send that file of documents to the local US embassy or consulate closest to where the intended traveler will be flying out of. And this is a process that we typically, again, start at 3 months prior to the birth. We take about 4 to 6 weeks to collect the file. And then at 6 weeks prior to the due date, that's when we send our petition to the embassy. And I'll explain the timing in a moment. In the documentation, we of course provide copies of your passports, ESTAs, and visas. And if it's a surrogacy case, we provide a copy of the surrogacy contract, the pre-birth order establishing a parent-child relationship if it's already available. We also will provide a letter from our law firm and a letter from a medical professional, in most cases the IVF doctor, explaining the national interest exception and why you should be allowed to enter the US. And we also provide a COVID statement. This COVID statement essentially is something that the client will sign, attesting to their health status as to whether they've ever had COVID or have it currently, been treated, or et cetera, and also what their isolation and quarantine plans are upon arrival. And the idea is to submit all of this documentation about 6 weeks prior. Now that's a specific timeline, and that's because if we submit too soon, earlier than that, it would be great to have all this done and out of the way with no worries. But there's 2 reasons why we wait that long. First of all of the embassies and the consulates around the world are completely overwhelmed with travel requests. The pandemics have created travel bans and travel nightmares in all other kinds of areas as well. So they're really overburdened right now with travel requests. So if it's not an emergency, it goes into a non-urgent pile. We don't want to go to the non-urgent pile. We want to go to the urgent pile. So we wait until 6 weeks before. The other thing that's affected the timing is that once the national interest exception is granted, it's only good for 30 days. Okay? You can only travel to the US. It's a national interest exception for entry for 30 days from the time that it's granted. So if we go too soon and get the permission within a day or two, and some embassies have been that quick, then you've only got 30 days. Your coupon is only good for entry for 30 days. So again, you have to be considerate of that timing. Okay.
And are you finding, I think I understood that you have to apply in the country in which you're living. So if you're in France, you've got to apply to the US embassy in France. If you're in the UK, you've got to apply the embassy in the UK. Is that correct?
Correct. And if you're a UK citizen living in Germany and you'll be leaving from Germany to go to the US, then you apply to the US embassy in Berlin.
Oh, okay, cool. And then, so the 30-day thing, I kind of get that, because you apply now, you've got a baby born to be due in 4 or 5 months. You've got to fly in early.
Right.
Because you don't want to have to do the whole process again, correct?
Correct. I don't know if they'll simply renew the authorization. We've never had that situation. I don't want to really press the issue, to be honest.
Not really, no, exactly. Okay, great. So then you get the national interest exemption or whatever you're calling it, and then you fly in. How, because obviously when this first kicked off as well, we had the issue of passports and all that stuff with children. So we've done all of that. We're in the country, we're good. And then now what's happening?
So if you're in the US, then a couple of things that you need to be thinking about once you get here. First of all, from a healthcare and public health guideline perspective, hospitals here have had different restrictions on who they allow into their facilities, especially during the pandemic. When it first broke out, hospitals were being very strict about this and only allowing patients who needed medical care inside the hospital. Parents who had children being born to surrogates were not allowed entry. Only the surrogate who's giving birth was allowed to enter. Now, every hospital has, modified their own policies as the pandemic has evolved over the last several months. So the best thing to do is to check the labor and delivery department's policies very close to the time that you plan on traveling, and just be prepared for the possibility you may not be allowed in the delivery room, you may not be allowed in the hospital at all. Again, it will vary depending on how things are going with the pandemic.
Right, okay. Gosh, I hadn't even thought about that one. So you've now got your child, we figured that bit out. The next step would then be obviously the passport, the US passport for your child.
For the child, right. So when the pandemic broke out, the US State Department essentially closed all of the US State Department passport offices. You could only apply by mail, and they were behind as it was. And to get a passport would take anywhere from 10 to 12 to 16 weeks. So there were no expedited passports available unless there was a life or death medical emergency, in which case they still have that option of getting a passport within 72 hours. That has been improved significantly. Several months ago, back in September, we were informed that they were renewing this expedited passport processing. Pre-pandemic, it was 3 to 5 business days, maybe 1 day, depending on how much you wanted to pay for the expediting. Now we're looking at about 10 days. Okay. So it's much better than 10, 12 to 16 weeks. Right. The difficulty is that you do need to go in person to one of the US State Department regional passport offices and get an appointment, and those appointments are limited. You can either call in yourself to try to get one online, or you can use a passport and visa expediter service to help you, because these expediters typically are granted a certain number of appointments that they can assign out through their company. So if you can get an appointment—
basically use one of those.
Yes. Yes.
Spend your time looking after your child, not on the internet trying to get an appointment. Right. Got
Correct.
You. Okay.
Correct.
Brilliant. Now, and I guess, yeah, go.
Yeah. So if there's a problem with the State Department, again, and passport expediting or any passport processing is closed down again, then the alternative would be to, apply to the home country for the child's either UK or German or EU passport, or apply for what's called a laissez-passer, which is a French phrase for let pass. And that's an emergency travel document that would allow the child to travel back to the home country, even without a passport. But it's a one-time thing.
Again, interesting information. Great. I guess the million-dollar question: does a presidential proclamation continue through to a new president?
That's an excellent, timely question. I think we're all waiting to see what the president-elect will do. I believe there may be more important executive orders that he may want to focus on initially. Currently, we're being told that President-elect Biden does not expect to have the country enter into a national lockdown of any kind. I suspect that this will be a slow rollout of new procedures. I suspect that they will re-examine whether there needs to be a travel ban from these specific countries when, in honesty, the pandemic has gone global. It's not just in Europe, it's not just in UK, it's not just in China, it's everywhere. So I suspect they'll look at it, but until then, these proclamations remain in place.
Okay, brilliant. Rich, thank you so much. Again, fantastic information, obviously very timely for all of our clients trying to get into the United States and who are worried about being there for the birth of their children. Thank you very much, and we'll talk to you very soon.
My pleasure.